At first glance, you could be forgiven for thinking that the salt marshes of New Jersey are devoid of life. However, if you peek through the sawgrass and into the murky water, a bustling world of tiny creatures will be revealed, and where there is abundant prey, predators won't be far behind. This is a common tern, and he is hard at work with a vital task: catching enough food to keep his babies fed. After hatching earlier in the summer, these chicks have grown rapidly and are now fully fledged, ready to leave their nesting grounds and learn how to care for themselves. With some help from their parents, of course. The terns are in a race against time, as they need to gear up for the most arduous journey of their lives so far, their first ever migration. This annual phenomenon is one of the most complex in the animal world, but its story is indelibly tied to the salt marsh, and though few people realize it, our stories are too. Far from just a haven for birds, this ecosystem may hold the key to saving our planet from its most existential threats. And today, we are going to show you how the lives of these birds, and our own, are connected in ways you would never imagine. My name is Evan, and this is Harrison. We're twin brothers following our dream to share the true life stories of the animals we love to help you become an insider in the natural world. In our daily lives, we pass by natural spaces all the time without paying them any mind. But part of being an insider in nature is recognizing that even the seemingly mundane habitats that exist right alongside us are more rich and complex than you might expect. The salt marsh of New Jersey is one of those places. To most people, this habitat appears to be nothing more than an unsightly expanse of sawgrass and mud, but in fact, it plays an irreplaceable role in a vitally important natural event. The salt marsh falls along a major bird migration route, and every year, thousands of birds flock to this region to rest as they make the long and taxing journey to their breeding or wintering grounds. We've come to this fascinating and often overlooked habitat during the peak of the fall migration to catch up with the birds moving through the area and examine how they're coping with the rampant climate change that's affecting the salt marsh ecosystem. To do that, though, we need to find some birds, and soon after entering the marsh, we encountered one of New Jersey's most recognizable species.
If you can hear those calls behind me, those are the iconic calls of the laughing gull. That's where they get their name, actually. Anyone who spends time here in coastal New Jersey is familiar with that call. So it's really cool to see not only some laughing gulls in natural habitat here, but huge populations of them. This is really exciting.
Laughing gulls are summer residents here in New Jersey, and they're one of the most ubiquitous birds in the region due to their abundance and tendency to move into human areas. Each season, they congregate in huge numbers to breed and raise their offspring, which occurs throughout New Jersey and all along the east coast of the US. They disperse throughout the state for most of the summer, but at this time of year, many individuals gather in the salt marsh for a very important purpose. These birds are getting ready to migrate.
There are a bunch of laughing gulls out on the mud flat in front of us, and we've noticed something interesting. These birds are already in their winter plumage. Now, during the summer, in the breeding season, laughing gulls have black heads that make them pretty distinct from other species, but right now, in their non-breeding plumage, their heads will either be white or gray, and they're a lot duller. Now, seeing them already in that winter plumage indicates that the season is starting to turn. It's still late summer, but fall is fast approaching. And that means that there should be a lot of migratory birds moving through this habitat for the fall migration. The salt marsh is an incredibly important location for a lot of migratory birds, so this should give us a great opportunity to see what kind of birds are moving through this habitat in this time of year.
After breeding, laughing gulls migrate down through the Caribbean and northern South America, which they do by following a set migration route called the Atlantic Flyway. This path, which starts in Greenland at its northernmost point and runs down the east coast of the United States, through the Caribbean, and finally into South America, is utilized by a wide variety of bird species, and it's especially important for shorebirds and water birds. The Atlantic Flyway has been established as a consistent migration route for birds because its path is largely unobstructed by mountains, and it provides reliable access to food and water at many points along its course. These areas, called stopover points, are a critical resource for migratory birds, as most species need to stop to rest and replenish their energy several times on the journey. Migrating birds will typically return to the same stopover points each year to capitalize on consistent food and water sources, so these locations attract an impressive diversity and abundance of migratory species. The salt marshes of New Jersey are a key stopover point for many shorebirds, and the refuge we are visiting harbors a particularly rich population of migratory birds because it contains one of the largest expanses of well-preserved salt marsh in the area. We saw several flocks comprised of many different species, but with numbers this immense, you may be wondering how all of these birds can be supported in the same place. To answer that question, we need to dig deeper into how the food web here is structured.
I have to say, when you look out over the marsh like this, it looks completely empty, but we've just spotted something that totally negates that idea. I mean, that's the thing about the salt marshes. It's a deceptive habitat. It's not until you look a little closer that you start to understand how this habitat functions. Now, take a look down here. There are hundreds of Atlantic marsh fiddler crabs scattered all along this little mud flat, and thousands more spread out throughout the marsh. And it's these little crustaceans and the bait fish down in the water here that all of the birds are feeding on. And when you see huge populations of prey species like this, it starts to make more sense how a seemingly empty habitat like the salt marsh can support such a staggering diversity and abundance of birds.
The unique features of the salt marsh provide the perfect conditions for the huge variety of birds that gather here to build up their energy reserves. As not only are food sources abundant, but the habitat allows species with many different feeding strategies to capitalize on them. The layer of water that covers the mudflats is quite shallow in a lot of areas, providing the ideal place for small shorebirds and gulls to rest and forage without disruption. We saw many flocks of semi-palmated sandpipers probing the mud for invertebrates, and they need the fuel, as these tiny birds are making one of the longest migrations of any species here. They've flown in from their breeding sites in the lower reaches of the Canadian Arctic, and they're gathering all of the food they can before making an over 4,000-kilometer flight across the Atlantic to their wintering grounds in northern South America, often without stopping. They top out at just over 50 grams, so without feeding on mudflats like this, these sandpipers would have no chance of making this journey. Elsewhere in the marsh, unbelievable congregations of herons and egrets are skillfully catching fish along the channels and deeper pools, and watching these birds forage in such astounding abundance was one of the highlights of our birding here. The great blue heron is a resident species and will often overwinter in this region, while the stunning great egret and the smaller but no less beautiful snowy egret are both getting ready to migrate to the warmer climates of the southern US, the Caribbean, and Latin America. Their long legs and dexterous necks are perfect for stalking through the water and spearing fish, but birds like the double-crested cormorant, whose legs leave a little bit to be desired, have to rely on a different hunting technique. These birds are adept swimmers, sometimes pursuing prey up to 7.5 meters down, and it was fascinating to watch big groups of them chase schools of fish in the deeper water. We saw more cormorants here than we have ever seen anywhere else in the world, and this marsh represents a crucial wintering ground for the species, as thousands will gather here now that their breeding season has ended. Perhaps the most interesting behavior that we got to observe was this common tern feeding its chicks, a behavior that is actually often carried out by the male terns more frequently than the females. These two chicks are just learning how to fish for themselves, but it takes some practice, as terns are plunge divers, meaning that they will fly up to 6 meters above the water's surface before diving down and catching small fish in spectacular fashion. Common terns are another species that will breed in New Jersey, up the East Coast, and into much of Canada, and they're gathering all the fish they can before continuing on to winter along almost the entire coast of South America and much of the Caribbean. We have only scratched the surface of the bird activity that is playing out here in the marsh, but our next sighting was particularly special, as we got to highlight one of the true apex predators of this ecosystem.
What do you want, bro? There are 2 ospreys on that pole over there, and one of them has a fish. Now, this is one of the top predatory species of the marsh here, a really important bird to have around. And ospreys will spend the summers here in New Jersey, but they are actually gearing up for a migration of their own. This species will move down to the southern United States, and some individuals will migrate as far as Central and South America. These are really impressive birds. They're feeding on fish primarily. They're incredibly effective predators, and definitely a species we wanted to catch up with, because when you know how the top predators are doing, that's a great reflection of the health of the entire ecosystem overall. So spending some time with the ospreys is a great way to kind of check up on how this habitat is doing.
Unfortunately, the salt marsh isn't doing as well as we would hope, as this habitat is facing an alarming number of threats. Human encroachment is a major driver of salt marsh decline, and here in New Jersey, a lot of the native stands of salt marsh have been cleared to make room for shore towns, highways, and other infrastructure. In addition to the direct habitat destruction caused by coastal development, the noise pollution from these human areas further disturbs the wildlife that is able to cling on in the small fragments of habitat that remain. However, the most significant threat to the salt marsh comes from global climate change. As a primarily coastal habitat, the salt marsh is extremely sensitive to changes in sea level, and the rate of sea level rise has increased dramatically due to glacial melting and the increased intensity of storms brought about by global climate change. What's more, not only is the water level rising, but it's also getting warmer, which negatively impacts the communities of plants, invertebrates, and fish that the salt marsh ecosystem is built on. The adverse effects of climate change are showing no signs of slowing, and if left unchecked, they will put even more stress on this already delicate ecosystem.
Evan is getting some shots of the incredible congregation behind us. There are gulls and swans and all sorts of other seabirds in there. But one thing we wanted to talk about is that even though the diversity on the marsh is absolutely incredible, neither of us can get over it today. Unfortunately, these animals are not immune to the global climate change that is drastically affecting this region. Unfortunately, the birds here are suffering from extreme heat, the reduction of their food supplies from the weather that we're having, and these problems that are facing the wildlife are the exact same climate problems that are facing people all over the world.
Absolutely. I mean, we all live on the same planet, right? So all the headlines that we're seeing of the natural disasters in places where they don't normally occur, the wildfires in Hawaii and Canada, we're seeing hurricanes in California where they don't normally happen. Those phenomena affect people and wildlife alike.
And they're symptoms of the same problem.
Absolutely.
These are driven by climate change, anthropogenic climate change, meaning change that occurs from the actions of people, and it affects the animals and us in very similar ways. So if you think about it that way, the fight to protect these animals is also the fight to protect ourselves.
Now, that's a pretty bold statement, but to really understand how important the salt marsh is for our world, you first need to consider the ecological roles of the birds that are utilizing this habitat. Though their individual feeding strategies and distributions are quite diverse, a lot of these birds are high-level consumers in their respective ecosystems. And in fact, something like a great egret or an osprey would be considered one of the top predators in that environment. That means that they're exerting control over all the prey species below them and helping to keep those populations in check and the food web balanced.
Not only that, but because these birds are migratory, they're not just influencing the salt marshes in New Jersey. They are regulating ecosystems from the Arctic tundra all the way down through the tropics. Tens of thousands of these critically important animals gather in marshes like this every year, and if anything were to happen to those populations or prevent them from using the habitat effectively, ecosystems all over the Americas could be destabilized or even collapse if the effects are prolonged. This is a great demonstration of how things in nature can be connected in ways that are more complex than we would ever expect.
The importance of allowing bird migrations to be carried out successfully is clear, and the impact that these birds have on their ecosystems is instrumental to the function of the salt marsh. However, that only begins to address how important the salt marsh is for our own lives,
Right.
which is probably something not a lot of people realize. Just to illustrate some of the uses that this habitat provides, salt marshes protect our coastlines from rising water levels, help to stabilize beaches and surrounding land, filter pollutants that enter the water, and provide critical habitats for commercially important species like fish and oysters.
Most importantly of all, the salt marsh and wetlands like it are some of our best defenses against global climate change, which represents perhaps the single greatest threat to life on Earth as we know it.
Climate change is driven in large part by the buildup of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that trap heat from the sun within the Earth's atmosphere. And this accumulation is what causes the massively increased temperatures, changes in global weather patterns, and all the other negative effects that we associate with climate change. What makes the salt marsh so useful in combating this phenomenon is that it captures carbon from the atmosphere at an incredible rate, and in fact, it does so at 10 times the rate of even mature tropical rainforests. What's more, wetlands like the salt marsh store up to 5 times more carbon per acre than rainforests, because not only is it stored in living plants which use carbon to grow, but it's also captured by plants for a long period of time after they die. Normally, when a plant dies, the carbon that it stored is released back into the atmosphere by decomposition. But the unique chemical properties of the water and the soil in the salt marsh slow down this process significantly. As layers of sediment and water cover the plant material, the carbon becomes trapped in the substrate, and it can remain there for hundreds or even thousands of years as long as the habitat isn't disturbed. This means that protecting and restoring intact salt marsh can be a more effective tool in fighting climate change even than reforesting tropical rainforests, and doing so is one of the best ways that people in this region can help mitigate the effects of the climate crisis. This issue is not just on the horizon somewhere. The effects of global climate change are being felt right now by people and wildlife just about everywhere. But with the right knowledge and the motivation that this beautiful habitat provides, we can make the changes we need to protect all of our life stories into the future. If you want to see another adventure from the salt marsh and learn about some of this country's most overlooked animals, check out this video where we show you some of the invertebrates of the salt marsh that form the foundation of this incredible ecosystem. And with that, we hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one.